Hello everybody, welcome to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So today we're here to do Thursday night, an episode of Metal, featuring none other than Judas Priest. Yes, the mighty Priest, or the Metal Gods if you prefer. Now, Judas Priest was one of those original metal bands that I got into, along with Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden. They were basically the three metal bands I listened to growing up. Judas Priest probably came right after, with their Screaming for Vengeance album, right after I got into Black Sabbath. So basically they were one of the first metal bands that I listened to, and they were one of the first metal bands, period. So, going to give you a little bit of a brief history. Their early history is a little complex because of so many members. Suffice to say that none of the original members of the band ever played on any Judas Priest album. So they're one of those few bands that have no original members. Yes is another band like that. Leonard Skinner now has no original members left in the band either. So this is a common thing, and you're going to see this more and more often because people are getting old, right? So I'll give you a little brief history of them. So this band was formed in 1969 by Al Atkins on vocals, Brian Staplehill on bass, John Perry on guitars, and John Partridge on drums. So none of those guys ever played on a Judas Priest album, but they were the original four members of Judas Priest. Shortly after they formed, Perry committed suicide and was replaced by Ernst Chataway. Yes, Ernst Chataway, who played with Earth, and Earth was the forerunner to Black Sabbath. Also trying out to replace Perry was KK Downing, but he did not get the job. So the next thing that happened was that they adopted the name Judas Priest from the ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, a song written by Bob Dylan. Partridge then left the band in 1970, was replaced by Fred Woolley. They had, at this point, an unknown, I'm not going to go into the record label, but they had a record label that had promised them 3 albums, but the record label folded, so the band kind of somewhat disbanded. And Atkins joined another band called Freight. This happened in 1972. He joined Freight, which had KK was in this band by this time. Also in this band was Ian Hill, who eventually has been the bass player for Judas Priest since, and John Ellis, who was playing the drums at the time. The members of the band decided at that point to take on the name of Atkins' former band, Judas Priest. They thought it sounded better, I guess, than Freight. Ellis then quit shortly after and was replaced by Alan Moore on the drums. Moore then left and was replaced by Chris Campbell. So they went through quite a few drummers. They signed up with the Tony Iommi Management Agency. Atkins and Campbell left, replaced by Hiroshima's drummer John Hinch and vocalist Rob Halford. In 1974, they added, on the advice of their management, Glenn Tipton from the same management group. So he was also with a band that was playing in the Tony Iommi Management Group. The first album they produced at this point in time, their first album, was called Rock-a-Rolla, or Rocky Rolla if you prefer, with Roger Bain doing the producing. He also produced the Sabbath albums. So at this point, now we're going to get a little bit into some of the albums that they did and some of the things that happened during the albums and some of the music, the way in which the music was for them. So the first album, Rocky Rolla, first thing about it is that it does have some heavy metal elements to it. It's almost proto-metal in some ways, hard rock proto-metal, but it did have a lot of progressive elements to the music. Album wasn't really produced the way the band wanted, and a lot of them think the album sucks. I actually think it's a good album. I don't own it, but it's a good album. The next album is really the first kind of Judas Priest album. This is the album where they started to solidify that metal sound, Sad Wings of Destiny. And so just so you know, that Hinch left the band and was replaced by Moore again, came back for the rest of that album. Then Moore left and was replaced again when they did their next album. He was replaced by a session musician, and then after that, which was Simon Phillips, and Simon Phillips did not stay with the band, so they had to get another drummer, which turned out to be Les Binks. So the third album, which is Sin After Sin, much more Judas Priest sounding. This is the beginning of their real sound, I think. For me anyways, this is the album that I really identified with them being Judas Priest. So Les Binks then joins on the Stained Glass album, which is this album, which is a fantastic album. This is one of their best. Lots of classic Judas Priest on this album. You got Exciters on here, Beyond the Realm of Death is on here, Invaders on here. Yeah, so this is the beginning of that classic Judas Priest, real classic stuff. Still really heavy though, like the first three albums. Very raw. Well, at least Sin After Sin and Sad Wings of Destiny. All three of these. This one, Sad Wings of Destiny, Sin After Sin, all very heavy, really kind of a heavy raw sound to them. Good album. So this is a fantastic album. So then they Les Binks, now he's in the album. Many consider him to be the best drummer they've had. So he is on the next album, which is Killing Machine. The beginning of their commercial era. They started moving towards that commercial. This had some commercial songs on it. Pretty solid album. I'm going to refer to my notes a bit here. Yeah, so this is a good album. The first of their kind of commercial sounding albums. Then the next one, of course, is British Steel, which I do not own, but it has it has a couple of really solid radio staples like Living After Midnight, and there's a couple of others on here. At this point in time, Binks has left the band. He didn't get paid to do this album, Unleashed in the East, which is considered their best live album. So he was on this. This is his farewell, but he didn't get paid for it, so he left and was replaced by Dave Holland, who had already been successful with another band. So Dave Holland becomes the classic era drummer for the next decade or so, and the band begins to pump out some really heavy albums, British Steel being the first real commercial breakthrough. And then you got Point of Entry, which is a bit of a dud in the catalog. I still haven't even listened to it. It's still got the sticker on it. Not the best of albums. It does have a few. Heading Out on the Highway. It's got a few songs that you'll know, but not a particularly heavy album. Maybe a little bit too commercial. But this is the classic era of the band. The next album out that they did after Point of Entry was maybe my favorite album. Love this album, Screaming for Vengeance. Really heavy, but some commercial sounds to it with things like You Got Another Thing Coming and The Electric Eye. But that first side of this album, The Hellion, Electric Eye, Riding on the Wind, Bloodstone, Take These Chains, and Pain and Pleasure, such a strong side of an album. One of my favorites album sides, definitely in the top 2 or 3 heavy metal album sides. The second side is not bad either, with Screaming for Vengeance, Another Thing Coming, Fever, and Devil Child. This is a strong album. The beginning of that kind of artwork that they liked to do. Now, who was it, the artist? I do not recall. This was also produced by Tom Allen as well. So a great album. Then they move on to their next album, which is kind of similar in a lot of ways. It's got that same kind of artwork going on here. Defenders of the Faith, this couple of years later. My notes tell me that this one had 3 kind of hits to it, radio hits. Some Heads Are Gonna Roll, of course, Love Bites, and what was the other one? Was it Defenders of the Faith? No, I think it wasn't. I can't remember. Was it Jawbreaker? No, I don't think so. Oh, Free Wheel Burning. Yeah, I forgot. So you got 3 kind of hits on here, but the deeper cuts: Jawbreaker, The Sentinel, Rock Hard, Ride Free, Eat Me Alive. These are a lot of really good Heavy Duties on here. Heavy Duty's a little bit lame, but yeah. So, and Defenders of the Faith, of course. So this is a strong album in a strong period for them. Another semi-commercial album, of course. Then they move on to Turbo, which is maybe their worst album. Very, very much commercial sounding. Lots of commercial songs on this album. A lot of people like this. They kind of introduced the use of synthesizers on this as well. And the topics changed from those dark, heavy topics to more of a love and romantic feel type topics, which really isn't a Judas Priest thing. So this album was a disappointment to most fans, and it was for me as well. The next album out, Ram It Down. It's kind of it's the last album that Dave Holland, the drummer, was on. He had been on them for over 10 years. It's kind of, when they made Turbo, they kind of wanted to make a double album, but at the last minute the record label didn't want them to do that, so they kind of stuck with the front side of the album. Or the first album was going to be more not pop, but more commercial oriented rock, and then the second album was going to be more heavy Judas Priest sounding songs. And so what they did is they used the second half of the album and they made this album Ram It Down. It was at least 4 tracks from that session that ended up on Ram It Down, which is a better album, I think. The only thing is they have a couple of really shitty tracks on this album. They did a cover of Johnny Be Good, which really doesn't sound anything like it, and just terribly weak for the album. Yeah, just not a great album, I think. Just kind of it's got that kind of a leftover feel, I think. And of course it's the last album for Dave Holland. And then they switch and they bring in Scott Travis on the drums, and Rob Halford actually leaves off to the next album, which is this album. Actually, I think he left after. Did he sing on this one? Yeah, I think he did. Yeah, he sang on Painkiller. This is the first kind of album with the new drummer Scott Travis. He's a much more speed metal oriented, and you can tell he's had a huge impact on this album. It's a much more fast-paced, speedy album than you were getting. Especially Painkiller is one of the fastest songs they ever did. So yeah, not a bad album, but very different sounding from its predecessors. The next album up, which is their 13th and 14th studio albums, features Ripper Owens on vocals on both of them. The albums sound a little more like death metal. There's a little bit of a growl to Ripper's voice in some cases. It definitely has that darker death metal feel to these albums. They don't really, to me, they don't really sound like classic Judas Priest albums. I don't mind them. I mean, he's good for what he is, but I don't think it suits the band very much. They're not really Judas Priest albums in my way. Then Halford comes back on Angels and Retribution. This is also a little bit more speed metalish, but does have some classic Priest stuff on it. Halford, of course, has rejoined the band at this point. Then they come up with this bizarre album that doesn't really fit anywhere. Nostradamus. It's a very different kind of album. It's a concept album, very unlike. There's a lot of keyboards and there's a lot of orchestra and there's some choir in here, and yeah, very unlike Judas Priest. But a lot of bands were doing it at this point in time, so they wanted to be modern, so I guess they did it. But to me it's the worst album, and it's also the final album of K.K. Downing as he left the band. Then you've got 2 albums left on their run. So they had Redeemer of Souls, very heavy. It's a solid album. Richie Faulkner's first album with the band as he replaces KT, and but it does have some of that speed metal sound to it as well. But it does have a lot of that classic sound. So I do like this album, and this is it here. This is a great cover as well. Redeemer of Souls. I think this is one of their better covers. And then they released one last album, which it came out in 2018, called Firepower. Returns Tom Allen to the production unit of the group. It has more of a classic sound, but again, it does have some speed metal elements because of the drummer. So yeah, pretty solid. But for me, most of the stuff that came out after, I would say after Ram It Down. Well, after Defenders of the Faith. So up to Defenders of the Faith, from about Sad Wings to Destiny to Defenders of the Faith. So their second to their 9th albums. Pretty classic and great Judas Priest stuff. Turbo was a turd, if you want to ask me. Did have a couple of songs that weren't too bad, but Ram It Down was better. Painkiller is different. It's the beginning of their speed metal era, and Jugulator and Demolition are more like that. Angels of Retribution, pretty solid comeback for Rob Halford. Then the bigger turd in Nostradamus. And Redeemer of Souls is pretty good, and Firepower are both pretty good for their last 2 albums. And I think they've been talking about producing another album too. This album is amazing as well. They're live in Unleashed in the East. It's so good. Although a lot of people have complained that they did a lot of overdubbing, too much overdubbing on the album. But it still sounds pretty good. I can't complain about it. Definitely a classic metal band. Considered one of the great metal bands of all time. The fact that they got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame so many years after they should have been in, and then they were put in through the side door by saying a supporting act, kind of a bit of a slap. I don't think that is an appropriate way to treat such a legendary band, and these guys were legendary. Just one great album after another for a series of albums. Starting with, to me, started with Stained Glass. Although Sad Wings of Destiny and Sin After Sin are great albums too. So you could probably start with Sad Wings of Destiny right through to Defenders of the Faith, and you wouldn't be wrong. That's like 7 or 8 album run, really solid. And even Rock and Roll, I like that as well, but not everybody does. So a solid band. Lots to offer if you're thinking about getting into metal. And this is a band that you should, if you're going to get into metal, you've got to kind of explore certain bands, and this is one of those bands. So there you have it. Judas Priest metal for this week. Next metal show will come in 2 weeks. We will have somebody from, so as you know, I do the old band 1 week, a band that's 10 years and older, and then a newer band 10 years and younger. So we'll be doing a newer band. I haven't chose one yet, but I'll be looking into it. I'm beginning to really like this show. I'm starting to get some kind of an idea of what I want to talk about, what I want to do. I think these guys today were great. They're a great band with great live shows, lots of high energy, lots of riffing and the classic rock sound. One of the pioneers of heavy metal, and they had a bit of more of a closer association with Sabbath than I had originally realized. But such a good band. 18 albums to choose from in the studio versions. Most of the earlier stuff is solid to great. So, give them a listen to, and you have yourself a good day. Please comment about what you like or don't like about the Judas Priest catalog, what you do and don't like about the band in general. Like and subscribe. It's much appreciated, and we'll be back next Thursday with the Forward Champion, and then 2 weeks after that with another episode of Metal. So have yourself a great day. Take care. Goodbye.